Deep in the heart of the megacity, where towers of glass and steel stretched so high they pierced the clouds and disappeared into perpetual smog, there existed a place that should not have been possible. The city sprawled for hundreds of miles in every direction, a dense labyrinth of concrete and neon, of elevated highways stacked 6 levels deep, of residential towers where millions lived in identical apartments stacked like filing cabinets into the sky. The air smelled of ozone and exhaust, and the particular metallic tang that came from too many machines operating in too small a space. The noise was constant, layered, overwhelming. The hum of electric vehicles, the drone of advertisement speakers, the bass rumble of the underground rail system, the endless chatter of millions of voices all talking at once, trying to be heard above the din. In this city, silence did not exist. Darkness did not exist. The lights never went out, the machines never stopped, and the people moved through their lives at a frantic, exhausting pace that seemed to accelerate with each passing year. But beneath all of this, hidden in the forgotten spaces between the city's steel bones, there were still places where the old world lingered. Sector 9 was one of these places. It had been abandoned for nearly 40 years, left to rust and decay after the great industrial collapse of the late 21st century. The factories that had once employed thousands stood silent, their conveyor belts frozen mid-motion, their furnaces cold and dark. The assembly lines where robots had once built components for the growing megacity were now home to nothing but dust and shadow. The laboratories where scientists had experimented with bioengineering and sustainable agriculture had been emptied, their equipment hauled away or left to decay, their projects abandoned, their carefully cultivated specimens forgotten. Most people in the upper city didn't even know Sector 9 existed. It had been deleted from the official maps, cordoned off behind chain-link fences and automated warning signs that declared the area structurally unsound, potentially hazardous, strictly off-limits. And for the most part, people listened. There were enough approved spaces to occupy their time, enough sanctioned entertainment to keep them distracted, enough legal pathways to walk that no one thought to wonder what lay beyond the fences, down in the deep levels where the city's original foundations still stood. But those who knew, the night wanderers, the seekers of quiet places, the people who could no longer bear the constant stimulation of the upper city, they knew that within the maze of corroded pipes and crumbling concrete, something extraordinary had taken root. They called it the Night Gardens, and it existed like a secret held between the ribs of the dying industrial zone, breathing softly in the darkness while the city raged on above. The gardens were not built by any city planner or corporate designer. They had not been commissioned or approved or integrated into the city's infrastructure. They had emerged slowly, organically, almost accidentally, from experiments left behind when the laboratories closed. In the final years before the collapse, a team of botanists and genetic engineers had been working on creating plants that could survive in the harsh conditions of the megacity, plants that could photosynthesize under artificial light, that could filter pollution from the air, that could grow in minimal soil with little water. They had experimented with bioluminescence, thinking that glowing plants might serve as sustainable lighting sources for the lower levels where electricity was expensive and maintenance was difficult. The experiments had been moderately successful. They had created several species of plants that glowed softly in the darkness, that thrived on neglect, that required almost nothing to survive. But the project had been abandoned before it could be commercialized, before anyone could figure out how to make it profitable. The scientists had packed up their essential equipment and left, locking the laboratory doors behind them, assuming that the experimental plants would simply die without care. They had been wrong. The plants had not died. Instead, they had escaped their containment. Spores had drifted through broken windows. Seeds had scattered through cracks in the walls. Root systems had broken through concrete floors, seeking water in the pipes below. And without human intervention, without pruning or control or constraint, the plants had spread. They wound through broken windows, climbing toward any source of light they could find. They climbed rusted girders, creating living curtains that swayed gently in the drafts that moved through the abandoned buildings. They softened the hard edges of concrete with curtains of glowing moss that pulsed with soft blue and green and violet light. What had begun as sterile science, as controlled experiments in carefully monitored conditions, had become something wild and gentle, a living tapestry that transformed the industrial decay into something resembling a dream. Over the decades, the plants had evolved, adapted, changed in ways their creators never anticipated. They had cross-pollinated, hybridized, developed new characteristics. Some grew larger than intended. Others developed new colors, new patterns of luminescence. A few seemed to have developed something like awareness, responding to touch, to sound, to the presence of visitors in ways that went beyond simple phototropism or chemical signaling. Ancient streetlights, somehow still powered by the city's forgotten grid, cast pools of amber warmth across stone pathways that wound through the gardens. These pathways had been carefully maintained by someone, or perhaps multiple someones over the years, cleared of debris, lined with stones, made smooth and safe for walking. No one knew who had first started tending the pathways, but the tradition had continued, passed from one night wanderer to the next, an unspoken agreement that this place deserved care, deserved respect. Artificial fireflies drifted through the air with patient, aimless grace, their bodies winking soft gold against the deeper glow of the plants. These were not living insects but tiny drones, no larger than a thumb tip, programmed generations ago as part of some experiment in autonomous systems. They had been designed to patrol the laboratories, to monitor conditions, to collect data. But like the plants, they had been left behind, and like the plants, they had continued their programming long after their purpose had been forgotten. Now they simply drifted, following ancient algorithms that had degraded into something resembling randomness, or perhaps something resembling play. The air in the gardens was always warm, always touched with mist that rose from channels of water trickling between the paths. The water came from somewhere deep below, a subterranean spring, perhaps, or a broken pipe from the city's water system that had become a gift rather than a problem. It flowed through channels that someone had carved or lined with stones, creating a network of small streams that fed the plants and filled the air with the constant, gentle sound of water moving over stone. The entire space hummed. Not loudly, not mechanically, but with a soft, meditative energy that seemed to emanate from the plants themselves, from the water, from the very stones beneath your feet. It was the kind of sound you felt more than heard, a frequency that settled into your bones and slowed your heartbeat, invited your breath to deepen, your shoulders to drop, your mind to finally rest. Scientists might have explained it as a combination of the bioluminescent plant's metabolic processes, the vibration of water through the channels, the resonance of the old industrial architecture responding to temperature changes. But those who visited the gardens regularly didn't care about the scientific explanation. They only knew that being here felt like being held, gently, by something larger and more patient than themselves. At the edge of these gardens, built against the skeleton of an old warehouse, stood a small glass house. It was a humble structure, no more than 15 feet on each side, its panels mismatched, some frosted, some clear, some tinted green with age, some cracked and repaired with careful applications of sealant. Its frame had been welded together from salvaged metal, bits and pieces scavenged from the surrounding ruins and joined with skill but not elegance. The welds were visible, unpolished, honest about their purpose. Warm light glowed from within the glasshouse, soft and amber, like candlelight though it came from a simple electric bulb. If you looked closely through the mismatched panels, you could see the silhouette of a woman moving slowly inside, tending to something, her movements careful and unhurried, her gestures suggesting someone who had all the time in the world and saw no reason to rush. This was Mara's home, and she was the night gardener. She had not always lived here. Like most people in the megacity, she had once lived in one of the residential towers, stacked in a small apartment on the 43rd floor of a building that housed over 2,000 people. Her apartment had been 11 feet by 14 feet, with a fold-down bed, a tiny bathroom, a kitchenette with 2 electric burners. One window that looked out onto the window of another tower just 50 feet away. She could see into the apartments across from her, could watch other people living their lives in identical spaces, and she knew they could watch her in return. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. She had worked a job that required her to be fast, efficient, always connected, always responsive. She monitored data streams for a logistics company, making split-second decisions about routing and resource allocation, optimizing delivery times, minimizing costs. The work was done entirely through a neural interface, information flowing directly into her visual cortex, decisions transmitted back through thought alone. It was efficient, it paid reasonably well, and it was slowly driving her insane. The neural interface meant she could never fully disconnect. Even when she logged out, even when she tried to sleep, she could feel the phantom sensation of data at the edge of her perception, a constant pressure against her consciousness. Her mind grew louder and louder, filled with numbers and routes and optimization algorithms, until she couldn't remember what her own thoughts had sounded like before the interface, before the job, before the city had taught her that every moment needed to be productive, every second needed to be optimized. Sleep became impossible. She would lie in her fold-down bed, staring at the ceiling 11 feet above her head, her mind racing through scenarios that didn't matter, solving problems that didn't exist, unable to stop, unable to slow down. She tried medication, prescription stimulants during the day to keep her sharp, prescription sedatives at night to force her brain into unconsciousness. It worked for a while, then stopped working. The dosages increased. Her hands started shaking. Her heart would race for no reason. She lost weight, then lost more weight, her body consuming itself because she kept forgetting to eat. Silence became something she feared because it revealed just how much noise lived inside her own head. She would leave her apartment and ride the elevator down 43 floors and walk the crowded streets just to be surrounded by external noise, by other people's chaos, by anything that might drown out the roar inside her skull. She went to a clinic. A doctor, exhausted, overworked, seeing 30 patients a day, told her she had acute anxiety, recommended different medication, offered a referral to a therapist she'd need to wait 4 months to see. The medication made her nauseous. She stopped taking it. She didn't make the appointment with the therapist. Instead, one night when she absolutely could not bear to return to her apartment, when the thought of riding the elevator up 43 floors and sealing herself into that 11 by 14-foot space felt like dying, she just started walking. She walked for hours through the lower levels of the city, descending deeper and deeper, taking stairs and ramps and maintenance corridors, following no map, no plan, just moving because movement was better than staying still. The crowds thinned as she descended. The lights grew dimmer. The advertisements disappeared. She reached levels where the infrastructure was older, less maintained, where the walls were covered in graffiti and water stains and the particular patina that comes from decades of neglect. She expected danger. She expected emptiness. She expected the hollow, depressing feeling of urban decay. Instead, she found light. Not harsh light, not the blinding neon that dominated the upper city, not the cold blue-white of LED advertisements, but a soft, living glow that seemed to breathe. It came from somewhere ahead, filtering through the gaps in a chain-link fence that had been partially cut open, the metal curled back like a wound. She approached carefully, her heart pounding, though whether from fear or anticipation she couldn't tell. She slipped through the gap in the fence, the cut metal catching on her jacket but not tearing it. Beyond was a corridor of broken concrete, walls on either side pressing close, the floor uneven and treacherous. But the light grew brighter and warmer, and she could smell something unexpected: earth and water and growing things. The corridor opened, and she emerged into the gardens. And for the first time in years, her mind went quiet. Not empty, she could still think, could still perceive, but quiet in a way she had forgotten was possible. The constant pressure of the neural interface, the endless optimization algorithms, the racing thoughts and phantom data streams, all of it simply stopped. Or rather, it receded into the background, became so much less important than the immediate, overwhelming presence of this place. She stood very still, barely breathing, afraid that any movement would break whatever spell had been cast. The bioluminescent plants glowed around her, blue and green and violet, pulsing gently like slow heartbeats. The air was warm and moist and smelled like rain even though they were deep underground, far from any weather. Water trickled somewhere nearby, a sound so simple and perfect it made her want to cry. She didn't cry. Instead, she walked forward slowly, her footsteps quiet on the stone pathway that led deeper into the gardens. There was no one else here. No voices, no screens, no demands. Just plants and water and soft light and silence, real silence, the kind that exists outside your head, not the terrible kind that exists inside it. She walked for what might have been an hour, or might have been 3 hours. Time felt different here, elastic, unimportant. She followed the pathways as they curved and branched, discovering small clearings and quiet pools, finding places where the plants grew so thick overhead they created tunnels of living light. And with each step, each breath, she felt something inside her loosening, unwinding, releasing its grip. She found herself sitting eventually, on a flat stone beside a channel of water, just watching the water flow. She couldn't remember the last time she had just sat somewhere without checking her neural interface, without monitoring data streams, without doing anything productive. The guilt that should have accompanied this inactivity didn't come. Or rather, it came and then passed, like a wave that crashes and then recedes, leaving the beach smooth behind it. She returned the next night, and the next. She told no one at work where she was going. She told her few acquaintances nothing about this place. It felt too precious, too fragile, like something that would disappear if she spoke about it, if she tried to share it, if she let the outside world know it existed. On her 4th visit, she discovered the glass house. It was set back from the main pathways, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, built against the wall of an old warehouse in a spot where several of the larger bioluminescent plants grew close together, their light providing a natural illumination. The door was unlocked. Inside, she found evidence that someone had lived here once: a sleeping mat, some old blankets, a few tools, some dried food in sealed containers. But the dust on everything suggested no one had been here in months, perhaps years. She cleaned the glass house. She brought a few things from her apartment: clothes, a few books, her kettle. She told herself she was just preparing a place to rest during her visits, a shelter in case she needed it. But she knew, even then, that she was making a decision. 2 weeks after discovering the gardens, she stopped going to her job. She didn't quit formally, she simply stopped logging in, stopped responding to messages. Her employment would be automatically terminated after 3 consecutive days of absence. Her apartment lease would be cancelled. Her belongings would be disposed of. In the megacity, disappearing was easier than leaving properly. People did it all the time, fell through the cracks, became unaccounted for. The system noticed, updated its records, and moved on. She moved into the glasshouse with almost nothing. A bedroll. A change of clothes. Her kettle. A few books she'd had since childhood. A mechanical watch her grandmother had given her, one of the last analog timepieces she'd ever seen. She didn't need much. The gardens provided everything else: water from the channels, warmth from the air, peace from simply being here. Over the first weeks and months, she began to learn the gardens. She discovered that the bioluminescent plants required very little care. They had been engineered for resilience, designed to survive without human intervention. But she also discovered that they responded to attention, to presence, to something that felt less like maintenance and more like companionship. If she sat quietly beside a struggling plant, just breathing near it, just being present with it, it would often recover on its own, its light strengthening, its leaves unfurling. If she spoke softly to the plants as she passed them, they seemed to glow a little brighter, though this might have been her imagination, or might have been something real that science couldn't yet measure. She learned to move slowly. The gardens rewarded slowness, revealed themselves only to patient observation. If you rushed, you missed things: the way certain plants only bloomed at specific hours, the way the water channels created different sounds depending on the air temperature, the way the artificial fireflies followed particular patterns that changed with the seasons, even though they were underground and shouldn't have been able to sense seasonal changes. She learned to speak softly, when she spoke at all. Loud sounds felt wrong here, felt like violations of something sacred. She found herself whispering even when there was no one to disturb, her voice matching the quiet intimacy of the space. She built herself a small lantern from woven vines and gentle LEDs salvaged from broken equipment she found in the ruins. The vines came from a plant that grew near her glasshouse, flexible and strong when dried, perfect for weaving. The LEDs came from an old emergency light panel, their glow warm and steady. She wove the vines into a loose sphere around the LED cluster, creating something that looked almost organic, almost like a bioluminescent plant itself. She carried this lantern with her on her evening walks, its light warm and kind, a companion that asked nothing of her. Mara became a night gardener not through training or appointment, not through any formal decision or declaration, but through a slow, mutual recognition. The gardens needed someone to witness them, to move through their pathways with reverence, to notice when things shifted or changed, to be present with them in their quiet transformation of this forgotten space. And Mara needed the gardens in return, needed their softness, their patience, their absolute refusal to demand anything of her except presence. She learned the rhythm of the gardens. They were not static, not fixed, but living entities that changed with time, with temperature, with seasons that they somehow sensed even deep underground. Certain plants bloomed in cycles, their flowers opening and closing according to patterns that Mara slowly came to recognize. The water channels would flow faster or slower depending on conditions she didn't fully understand, perhaps rainfall somewhere far above, perhaps changes in the city's water pressure, perhaps something else entirely. She learned to read the plant's health not through any scientific knowledge but through intuition, through simply spending so much time with them that she knew what they looked like when they were thriving, when they were stressed, when they were entering a new phase of growth. She would walk the pathways each night, observing, listening, occasionally making small adjustments, redirecting a vine that was growing into a space where it wouldn't receive enough light, clearing a channel that had become partially blocked with debris, gently pruning a dead section to make room for new growth, whispering encouragement to a struggling bloom. Her role was not mechanical. There were no schedules to keep, no protocols to follow, no metrics to meet. She didn't track her activities or measure outcomes or optimize her efficiency. She simply needed to pay attention, to be here, to witness. And in witnessing, she found something she hadn't known she was searching for, a purpose that didn't exhaust her, work that didn't drain her, a way of being useful that also allowed her to be at peace. The years passed quietly. Mara lost track of how many, 3, perhaps, or 4, or 5. It didn't matter. Time in the gardens moved at its own pace, measured not in hours and days but in cycles of growth and rest, in the slow transformation of the space as new plants spread and old ones faded, in the gradual accumulation of her own knowledge and understanding. She became thin but strong, her body shaped by the work of walking the pathways, of bending and reaching to tend the plants, of carrying water and tools. Her hands grew calloused but gentle. Her skin took on a slight luminescence from spending so much time in the glow of the plants, or perhaps this was imagination, wishful thinking, the desire to become part of this place she had come to love. She rarely saw other people, though occasionally, she would find evidence of other visitors, a footprint in the moss, a flower carefully picked, a small offering left beside one of the pools. She left these visitors alone, and they left her alone, respecting the unspoken rule that the gardens were a place of solitude, of personal contemplation, not of social gathering. Once, she glimpsed another night wanderer from a distance, an older man, sitting quietly beside one of the pools, and they had raised hands to each other in acknowledgement, but neither had approached, both understanding that words were unnecessary, that the gardens spoke for themselves. The city above continued its frenetic pace, its millions of people rushing through their lives, their schedules packed, their minds full, their bodies exhausted. But down here in Sector 9, time moved differently. Down here, Mara had found a rhythm that matched her breath, a pace that matched her heartbeat, and she had learned to trust it completely. Tonight, as she stepped out of her glasshouse into the warm, misty air of the gardens, she carried her woven lantern in one hand and a small wooden cup of tea in the other. The tea was made from leaves grown in her own small garden inside the glasshouse, a simple blend of mint and chamomile and something else she had discovered growing wild in the gardens, a plant with serrated leaves and small purple flowers that dried into something fragrant and slightly sweet. She had no name for this plant, had never seen it in any botanical database, and suspected it might be a hybrid that had emerged naturally from the mixing of the various engineered species. She called it Evening Star, for the way its dried flowers resembled tiny purple stars, and she had learned through careful experimentation that it made an excellent tea, calming without being sedating, warming without being stimulating. She sipped the tea slowly as she began her evening walk, letting its warmth spread through her chest, letting its familiar taste settle her into the present moment. The tea was almost too hot, requiring small sips, requiring patience, and this was exactly right, exactly what she needed to transition from the small concerns of her glasshouse into the larger presence of the gardens. The gardens greeted her with their usual soft glow, the bioluminescent moss along the pathways pulsing gently underfoot, guiding her steps like living lights marking a runway, like candles lit to welcome her home. The moss had spread since she first arrived, covering more of the pathways, filling in gaps, creating an almost continuous ribbon of soft blue-green light that wound through the entire garden. She had watched this spread happen slowly, week by week, month by month, the moss extending its tendrils into new territory, and she had found it deeply satisfying, this visible evidence of growth, of life expanding into available space. The artificial fireflies bobbed and weaved through the air, their tiny bodies winking gold against the deeper spectrum of the plant's glow. There were hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, distributed throughout the gardens, and Mara had come to recognize certain individuals, or at least, she thought she had. One seemed to follow the same route each night, circling a particular section of pathway 3 times before drifting away. Another always hovered near the water channels, occasionally dipping down to touch the surface before rising again. She had given them names in her mind, private names she never spoke aloud: Wanderer, Circler, Dipper, Dancer. Somewhere in the distance, water trickled over stones with a sound like distant conversation, like whispered secrets, like the particular music that water makes when it moves without hurry through a space that welcomes it. But something was different tonight. Mara noticed it immediately, the way you notice when a familiar room has been rearranged even before you consciously identify what has changed, the way you sense a shift in atmosphere before you can articulate what caused it. The quality of the light was not quite the same. The rhythm of the glow seemed to have shifted, become more complex, more layered, more intricate in ways her eyes struggled to track but her body somehow understood. She paused on the pathway, setting down her wooden cup of tea on a flat stone that she had long ago designated for exactly this purpose, a resting spot, a place to pause and observe. The stone was smooth, worn by water at some point in its long history, and warm from proximity to the plants. She watched the steam rise from her tea, curling in lazy spirals that dissipated into the misty air. And then she simply looked, allowing her eyes to soften, allowing her perception to widen, taking in the gardens as a whole rather than focusing on any particular element. The plants were not dimmer or brighter than usual. They had not faded or wilted or shown any signs of distress. But their patterns had changed. Where before they had pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, like breath, like the tide coming in and going out, now they seemed to be communicating in a more intricate language, one with more vocabulary, more syntax, more complexity. Waves of light moved through the moss, cascading from one section to another like messages being passed, like neurons firing in sequence, like a thought moving through a vast distributed mind. The waves would start in one area, ripple outward, intersect with other waves, creating interference patterns that reminded Mara of ripples on water when you drop two stones simultaneously, of murmuration in flocks of birds when they wheel and turn in perfect unison, of auroras borealis in the far north where charged particles dance in the magnetosphere. She had seen the gardens change before, seen new plants emerge, seen old sections die back, seen the slow progression of growth and decay and renewal that characterized all living systems. But this was different. This was not the slow march of seasons but something more immediate, more purposeful, more directed. She moved closer to a section of wall covered in glowing vines, setting her lantern down on the pathway so both her hands would be free, so she could give her full attention to this observation. The vines had been there for years, their growth steady and predictable, following the cracks in the concrete, seeking moisture and light according to their basic programming. She knew these vines intimately, knew which sections grew faster, which preferred particular orientations, which were more resilient to temperature changes. But now, new tendrils had emerged from the established growth, thin and delicate like thread, like hair, glowing with a brighter light than the parent vines. These new tendrils reached upward toward the broken ceiling high above, toward the faint glow of the city's neon skyline that filtered through the gaps in the industrial infrastructure, through the layers of elevated highways and suspended walkways and forgotten maintenance corridors that separated this deep level from the surface. The city's light had always been present, a dim pollution that seeped down through the layers, but the vines had never before seemed interested in it. They had always been content to grow horizontally, spreading across available surfaces, seeking the stable illumination of the streetlights or the reflected glow of other bioluminescent plants. But these new tendrils were reaching for something else, something higher, something beyond the immediate environment of the gardens. Mara reached out slowly, letting her fingertips hover just above one of the new vines without touching, respecting its delicacy, its newness. She could feel the warmth radiating from it, could sense something in the air around it, not heat exactly, not chemical, but something her body recognized even if her mind couldn't name it. Change. Active, intentional change. Growth happening not because conditions happened to be favorable but because the plant had decided, if a plant could be said to decide, that growth was necessary now, that reaching was required now, that something new needed to begin. She stood there for a long time, just observing, her breath slow and steady, her mind quiet but alert. One of the artificial fireflies drifted past, circling the new vine tendril as though inspecting it, as though it too recognized that something unusual was happening. The firefly's light pulsed 3 times, whether in communication or simply in response to its degraded programming. Mara couldn't say, and then it drifted away, continuing its eternal patrol of the gardens. Eventually, Mara picked up her lantern, retrieved her tea, now merely warm rather than hot, and continued down the pathway, her senses heightened now, paying closer attention to everything, looking for other signs of this change she had detected. She moved slowly, deliberately, stopping frequently to observe, to listen, to feel the quality of the air on her skin. The water channels that ran alongside the stone paths, fed by that mysterious underground source, were behaving strangely as well. The water still flowed, still trickled with its gentle music, still moved with that patient gravity-driven certainty. But now it seemed to ripple in patterns that had nothing to do with the movement of the current itself, patterns that appeared spontaneously on the surface, independent of any obvious cause. Mara knelt beside one of the channels, her knees pressing into the soft moss, and watched carefully. In the reflected light from the glowing plants, the water looked almost silver, almost metallic, almost alive in a way that went beyond its simple chemistry of hydrogen and oxygen. As she watched, a circle appeared on the surface, perfect and complete, expanding outward in concentric rings. Then another circle appeared nearby, and another, their rings intersecting, creating complex patterns of constructive and destructive interference. She dipped her fingers into the water, warm, soft, no different in temperature or texture than usual, and brought them to her lips, tasting. The water was clean, pure, slightly mineral from whatever underground source fed it, exactly as it had always been. But still, something had shifted in how it moved, how it expressed itself on the surface. The channels themselves had been here since before Mara arrived, carved or formed by some previous tender of the gardens, lined with smooth stones that channeled the water efficiently while creating pleasant sounds as the water passed over them. The engineering was simple but effective, and Mara had maintained them over the years, occasionally clearing debris or rearranging stones to optimize the flow. She knew these channels intimately, knew their sounds at different flow rates, knew where they tended to accumulate sediment, knew where they sometimes overflowed during particularly heavy flows from the mysterious source. But tonight, the water seemed to be asserting its own presence, its own agency, creating patterns that had nothing to do with the channel's shape or the stone's arrangement, patterns that emerged from the water itself. The gardens were responding to something. Or perhaps they were initiating something themselves. Perhaps there was no meaningful distinction between responding and initiating when you were dealing with a living system this complex, this interconnected, this old. Mara stood from her kneeling position, brushed the moisture from her fingers against her pants, soft cotton, worn thin from years of washing, comfortable in the garden's warm air, and made a decision. Tonight, she would walk the full circuit of the gardens, visiting each distinct area, each characteristic zone, observing carefully, trying to understand what was unfolding. She was not worried. The plants did not feel distressed. Their light was not dimming but changing, shifting, evolving. If anything, they felt more alive than usual, more present, more awake, as though something had roused them from a long contentment into a new kind of attention. She finished her tea in one long swallow. It had cooled to barely above ambient temperature, sweet with the evening star flowers, pleasant going down, and left the wooden cup on its designated stone. She would retrieve it on her way back to the glass house, later, when this night's observations were complete. For now, she wanted her hands free, wanted nothing to distract her from full attention to what the gardens were revealing. She began with the eastern section, where the pulse trees stood. The journey to the pulse trees took her along a pathway that wound through what had once been a loading bay, a massive space where trucks had backed up to receive cargo from the factories. The concrete floor still bore the painted lines and numbers that had once directed traffic, though they were faded now, partially obscured by moss and creeping vines. The loading bay was open on one side, and through the gap, you could see into the larger darkness of Sector 9, could sense the vast emptiness of the abandoned industrial zone stretching away into shadow. But here, along this pathway, the gardens had created something intimate and enclosed. Vines hung from the ceiling like curtains, some thick as Mara's wrist, others delicate as thread, all of them glowing with soft blue-green light that made the space feel like being underwater, like moving through an aquarium, like walking through a dream of the ocean. Mara moved through these hanging vines, letting them brush against her face, her arms, her body, feeling their warmth, their slight electric quality, the way they seemed to recognize her passage and respond with subtle shifts in luminescence. Some of the vines swayed gently despite the still air, moving in response to her presence or perhaps to their own mysterious rhythms. The vines smelled faintly sweet, like honey mixed with something green and growing, and occasionally one would release a puff of spores, harmless, iridescent particles that drifted in the air like glowing dust, like fairy lights, like tiny stars. Mara breathed them in without concern. She had been breathing the garden's air for years now and had suffered no ill effects. If anything, she felt healthier here than she had in the city above, her chronic headaches gone, her anxiety dissolved, her body strong and supple from the gentle physical work of tending the pathways. Beyond the hanging vines, the pathway opened into the grove where the pulse trees stood. These trees had been among the first successful bioengineered organisms created in the old laboratories, and they had survived decades beyond their creators' expectations, thriving in this forgotten space, growing larger and more complex than their design specifications had anticipated. Each tree stood about 20 feet tall, though a few had reached 25 or even 30 feet, their growth unconstrained by the pruning and shaping that their creators had originally imagined would be necessary. The trunks were smooth and cylindrical, perhaps 2 feet in diameter, their bark translucent like frosted glass or like very thick ice. Beneath this translucent bark, you could see a network of vessels, analogous to xylem and phloem but not quite the same, engineered to serve similar functions but with different mechanisms, that carried luminescent sap throughout the tree. The sap glowed with a soft blue-white light, bright enough to read by if you stood close, gentle enough that it never hurt your eyes, never created the harsh shadows and bright highlights that artificial lighting produced. The branches of the pulse trees extended horizontally from the trunks at regular intervals, creating a layered canopy overhead. The branches were also translucent, also filled with glowing sap, and from them hung clusters of what looked like translucent fruits or pods. Mara had never been sure whether they were reproductive structures or simply storage organs or something else entirely. These pods glowed more brightly than the rest of the tree, pulsing at the heartbeat rhythm that gave the trees their name. Under normal circumstances, under the conditions Mara had observed for years, the pulse trees glowed steadily, their light constant and peaceful, the pods pulsing at a rate of perhaps once every 2 or 3 seconds, creating a gentle visual rhythm that was deeply soothing, almost hypnotic. She had often sat beneath them just to watch that pulse, letting it slow her own breathing, letting it anchor her in the present moment. But tonight, as Mara approached the grove, she saw immediately that they had changed. The light within each tree was ticking, there was no other word for it, no better description for what she was seeing. Slow, rhythmic pulses of brightness moved from the roots upward through the trunk, into the branches, into the pods, creating waves of light that reminded Mara of a heartbeat displayed on a medical monitor, but infinitely slower, infinitely more patient, infinitely more deliberate. She stood at the edge of the grove, just watching, letting her eyes adjust to this new pattern, letting her mind absorb what she was seeing. There were 12 pulse trees in this grove, arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing, and each one was displaying this new behavior, this new pattern of luminescence. The pulses moved through them in sequence, one after another, creating a kind of visual rhythm that was almost musical, almost choreographed, as though the trees were performing together, as though they had rehearsed this and were now executing it with perfect timing. She entered the grove slowly, placing each foot carefully on the moss-covered ground, aware that she was entering a space that felt suddenly sacred in a new way, suddenly charged with significance. The air here was warmer than in the surrounding gardens, warmed by whatever process was creating this increased activity in the trees. It wrapped around her like a blanket, like an embrace, comfortable without being oppressive. She moved to the nearest tree. She had privately named it Elder, as it seemed to be the oldest and largest of the grove, and placed her palm flat against its smooth bark. The bark was warm, almost hot, pulsing with that new rhythm. Through her palm, she could feel it, a gentle thrumming, a vibration so subtle it might have been her imagination, except that it wasn't. It was real, it was there, undeniable. The tree was not just glowing differently, it was doing something, actively, purposefully. Energy was moving through it in new patterns, following pathways that had perhaps always existed but had never before been activated, or had been activated only in circumstances Mara had never witnessed. "Hello, Elder," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself, a habit she had developed over the years. "What are you doing tonight? What are you telling me?" The tree, of course, did not answer in any way that human language could capture. But Mara had learned long ago that speaking to the plants was not about expecting a verbal response. It was about acknowledging their presence, their aliveness, their participation in the world. It was a form of respect, of companionship, of recognizing that consciousness took many forms, not all of them comprehensible to human minds, not all of them interested in human concerns, but all of them deserving of recognition. She moved from tree to tree in the grove, placing her hand on each trunk, feeling the pulse, observing the patterns of light. Each tree had its own subtle variations in the rhythm, its own particular character in how the light moved through its vessels. Some pulsed faster, some slower. Some had brighter light in the upper branches, some in the lower. But they were all clearly coordinated, all clearly participating in the same phenomenon, the same awakening or transformation or whatever this was. In the center of the grove, in the clearing surrounded by the 12 trees, the moss grew particularly thick, creating a natural cushion. Mara had sat here many times before, finding it one of the most peaceful spots in all the gardens, a place where the light from the surrounding trees converged into something particularly beautiful, particularly calming. She sat down now, cross-legged, her lantern beside her casting its own warm glow that mixed with the blue-white of the pulse trees. She let her hands rest on her knees, palms up, an open gesture, a receptive gesture. She closed her eyes and simply listened, not with her ears but with her whole body, with whatever sense humans have that allows them to perceive changes in energy, in atmosphere, in the quality of a space. The grove hummed. She could feel it through the ground, through the air, through her skin. It was the same frequency she had always felt in the gardens, but amplified, intensified, made more present. It resonated in her chest, in her bones, seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat, with her breath, with the electrical firing of her neurons. She sat there for a long time. How long, she couldn't say. Time became fluid, elastic, irrelevant. She might have been there for 10 minutes or an hour. Her mind emptied of thought, became simply a space of awareness, of presence, of witnessing. This was meditation, though she had never called it that, had never studied any formal practice, had simply learned it naturally from spending so much time in the gardens, from the gardens themselves teaching her how to be still, how to be quiet, how to listen with more than ears. Eventually, she felt ready to move on, felt that she had received what the pulse trees were offering, though she couldn't have articulated what that was. She stood slowly, her joints a little stiff from sitting, and stretched her arms overhead, feeling her spine lengthen, feeling her body return to its normal awareness of itself as a distinct entity rather than something dissolved into the larger presence of the grove. She picked up her lantern and made her way out of the grove, following a different pathway than she had entered by. The gardens had many pathways, many routes, and Mara enjoyed varying her walks, discovering new perspectives on familiar spaces. This path took her through an area she called the Fern Cathedral, a section where massive bioengineered ferns had grown to extraordinary size, their fronds reaching 15 feet in length, creating a dense overhead canopy that filtered the light into something green and submarine. The ferns were not themselves bioluminescent, but they grew among glowing vines and moss, and their fronds caught and reflected this light, amplifying it, transforming the space into something that felt both ancient and alien. Walking through the fern cathedral was like walking through a jungle, through a rainforest, through some prehistoric landscape where plants ruled and animals were just beginning to emerge onto land. The air was particularly humid here, thick with moisture, heavy with oxygen. The ferns produced spores that drifted on the air currents, visible in the light as tiny motes of darkness against the glow, settling slowly onto every surface. Mara moved carefully here, aware that the ferns were more delicate than they appeared, their fronds easily damaged despite their size. She followed a narrow path that wound between the massive plants, occasionally reaching out to touch a frond, feeling its texture, leathery, strong, alive. The ferns were not behaving unusually tonight, as far as she could tell. They simply existed as they always had, magnificent and still, growing at their usual glacial pace, shedding spores according to their usual cycle. But Mara felt she should check on them anyway, should acknowledge them as part of her circuit, as part of the garden's totality. She emerged from the fern cathedral into an open area where old machinery still stood, massive gears and pistons frozen in place, relics of the industrial age that had created this space. The machinery had been made from steel and iron, materials chosen for durability, and even after decades of abandonment, they remained largely intact, though heavily corroded, covered in rust and scale. But the gardens had not ignored the machinery. Glowing moss covered much of it, softening the hard industrial lines into something more organic. Vines wrapped around the gears like ivy around old columns. Small plants had taken root in crevices and hollows. The machinery had been absorbed into the garden's aesthetic, transformed from pure function into something approaching sculpture, art created accidentally by the interplay of human engineering and natural growth. Mara liked this area, liked the reminder that the gardens existed in dialogue with what humans had built, that they were not pristine wilderness but something hybrid, something that emerged from the conversation between intention and accident, between design and evolution. Beyond the machinery, the pathway curved westward, toward the section where the glass lilies grew. This was Mara's favorite area of the gardens, the place she visited most frequently, the place she found herself drawn to when she needed comfort or beauty or simply a reminder of what made life worth living. The glass lilies grew from cracks in the concrete floor of what had once been an assembly area, a vast open space where products had been pieced together by robots and human workers side by side. The floor was still marked with attachment points where machines had been bolted down, circles and squares of corroded metal interrupting the concrete. But through every crack, through every gap, the glass lilies had found purchase. They grew in clusters, sometimes singly, their stems thin and flexible like fiber optic cables, rising anywhere from 1 to 3 feet from the ground. The stems themselves were translucent, filled with a milky fluid that carried nutrients and water, and they glowed faintly with scattered light from the surrounding plants. But the flowers were something else entirely. The petals were formed from some kind of organic crystal, thin as paper but strong as glass, completely translucent. During the day, the lilies remained closed, their petals folded tight like praying hands, like sleeping flowers, protecting their delicate internal structures from any harsh light that might filter down from above. But at night, particularly at midnight, they opened. Mara checked her watch, the mechanical one, wound daily, the one piece of technology she kept from her old life. The watch was beautiful in its simplicity, a white face, black numbers, hands that swept smoothly rather than ticking. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had lived in an era when people still wore watches for function rather than fashion, before everyone's timekeeping happened on screens and neural interfaces. The watch read 11:47. She had 13 minutes until the lilies would open. She would wait. She settled onto a flat stone near the edge of the clearing, a stone she had claimed long ago as her observation post for the lilies. The stone was smooth and slightly concave, shaped by water at some point in its geological history, and it fit her body perfectly, supporting her lower back, allowing her to sit comfortably for extended periods. She set her lantern beside her, adjusting its position so its light wouldn't interfere with her view of the lilies but would still provide enough illumination to see by. And then she simply sat, breathing slowly, letting her mind settle into that particular quality of attention that comes from waiting for something you know will happen, something you've seen many times before but which never loses its capacity to amaze. The clearing was roughly circular, about 30 feet across, and within it grew perhaps 40 or 50 glass lilies, distributed in a pattern that appeared random but which Mara had come to recognize as following the cracks in the concrete floor. The lilies grew only where their roots could penetrate deep enough to find water and nutrients in whatever soil lay beneath the industrial foundation. Above, through the broken ceiling of the warehouse that had once housed this assembly area, she could see fragments of the city, towers lit with neon advertisements cycling through their programmed sequences, aerial vehicles passing with their running lights blinking red and green, the constant pulse of a world that never slept, never slowed, never stopped selling and buying and moving and consuming. But here, down in the gardens, there was patience. There was time. There was the willingness to wait for beauty to unfold at its own pace, in its own time, according to its own internal clock that cared nothing for human schedules or human impatience. As midnight approached, Mara noticed that the air seemed to thicken slightly, the mist growing denser, forming a kind of veil that softened everything, made the boundaries between objects less distinct. The artificial fireflies began to gather, forming a loose cloud above the clearing, their lights dimming as though in anticipation, as though they too knew what was about to happen and were yielding the stage to the lilies. Mara's watch ticked toward midnight, 11:58, 11:59. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, feel the gentle rise and fall of her breath. The gardens around her had gone particularly quiet, the usual trickling of water fading to near silence, the usual rustling of plants in their slow growth stilled. It was as though the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. And then, precisely at midnight, the glass lilies began to open. It happened slowly, as it always did, each lily unfolding at its own pace but all of them coordinated by some signal Mara had never been able to detect, not temperature, not light level, not any obvious environmental trigger, but something internal to the plants themselves, some biological clock that kept time with extraordinary precision. The first petal to move was on a lily near the center of the clearing, one of the larger specimens that Mara had been observing for years. The petal, translucent, crystalline, shaped like a teardrop, began to separate from its neighbors, pulling away with an almost reluctant motion, as though releasing something it had been protecting. As it moved, it caught the ambient light from the surrounding bioluminescent plants, and that light refracted through the crystal structure, splitting into spectrum, creating tiny rainbows that shimmered across the clearing. And as the petal moved, it made a sound. The sound was soft, crystalline, pure, like the ringing of a tiny bell, like the note produced when you run a wet finger around the rim of a wine glass, like the sound of ice cracking on a winter lake but gentler, more musical, more intentional. It was a single clear tone that hung in the air for a moment before fading, leaving behind a kind of resonance, a memory of itself. Then another lily opened, releasing its own tone, slightly higher in pitch than the first, creating a harmony when their sounds overlapped. Then another, lower. Then several at once, their tones blending, creating chords. But tonight, the sound was different from what Mara had heard in all her previous observations. Usually, the lilies chimed randomly, each flower opening at its own pace within a span of several minutes, creating a gentle, chaotic music that was beautiful in its unpredictability, in its lack of structure. You never knew which lily would open next, which tone would sound, what the overall effect would be. It was like wind chimes, like rain on a roof, pleasant, soothing, but without intentional composition. But tonight, the lilies were harmonizing. Not randomly, not by accident, but deliberately, carefully, creating something that sounded almost composed, almost intentional, as though they were performing a piece of music that had been written specifically for this moment. As each lily opened, its tone blended perfectly with the others that were already open, creating chords that shifted and evolved, that built upon each other, that created progressions of harmony that made Mara's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The music was so beautiful it almost hurt, so perfect it seemed impossible that living plants could create it, so carefully structured that it suggested consciousness, intention, awareness of beauty for its own sake. Mara sat very still, barely breathing, tears streaming down her face though she hadn't consciously decided to cry, her body responding to the beauty with an emotional intensity she hadn't experienced in years. The music wrapped around her, not loud, never loud, but enveloping, filling the space between her thoughts, occupying every corner of her awareness. The lilies continued opening, one after another, sometimes in sequence, sometimes in clusters, their petals spreading wide to reveal the delicate reproductive structures within, structures that glowed with their own faint light, adding another layer of illumination to the clearing. Each opened lily added its voice to the chorus, its tone contributing to the evolving harmony, the shifting chords, the gentle music that seemed to be telling a story Mara didn't have words for but understood anyway, in her body, in her heart, in whatever part of humans recognizes beauty and responds to it with joy and sorrow mixed together. When all the lilies were finally open, and this took perhaps 10 minutes, though Mara had lost all sense of time, their petals were spread wide, trembling slightly as dew began to form on their crystalline surfaces. The dew appeared spontaneously, condensing from the humid air onto the cold crystal of the petals, and as each droplet formed, it caught the surrounding light and amplified it, creating points of brilliance that made the entire clearing sparkle as though filled with tiny stars, as though the night sky had descended into this forgotten industrial space and decided to make its home here. The music continued even after all the lilies were open, the tones sustaining, resonating with each other, creating overtones and undertones that added even more complexity to the sound. The lilies held their pose, held their song, their petals quivering with the vibration of their own voices, and Mara simply received it all, simply allowed herself to be bathed in light and sound and beauty. Eventually, and she had no idea how long it had been, how long she had sat there absorbing this experience, the tones began to fade, the lilies chiming growing quieter, softer, until finally there was silence. But not empty silence. Full silence, pregnant silence, the kind of silence that exists after music ends, when the sound has stopped but its presence still fills the space, still resonates in memory and body. Mara exhaled slowly, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, not ashamed of them, not embarrassed, just acknowledging them, honoring the emotion that had produced them. "You're beautiful," she whispered to the lilies, to the gardens, to the night itself. "You're always beautiful, but tonight you're singing together. Tonight you're telling me something." What they were telling her, she wasn't sure. But she felt it anyway, the same message the pulse trees had communicated, the same shift the vines and water channels were displaying. Something was changing. Something was beginning. Something new was emerging from the accumulated years of growth and patience and quiet existence in this forgotten place. She stood eventually, reluctantly, knowing there was more of the gardens to see, more areas to visit, more of this transformation to witness. The lilies would remain open for several hours before closing again at dawn, their petals folding back up to protect themselves from whatever harsh light might filter down during the day. She could return to them later if she wanted, could sit with them again, could listen to their sustained harmony. But for now, she needed to continue her circuit, needed to see what the other areas of the gardens were expressing tonight. She picked up her lantern, its warm glow suddenly seeming inadequate after the crystalline brilliance of the lilies, and made her way out of the clearing, following the pathway that led deeper into the gardens, toward the section she called the root walk. The pathway to the root walk led through a series of narrow passages where the industrial architecture pressed close on either side, where you could reach out and touch both walls simultaneously, where the ceiling lowered until Mara, who was not particularly tall, needed to duck slightly to avoid hitting her head on protruding beams and pipes. This section of the gardens always felt transitional, liminal, like a threshold between spaces, between states of being. The walls here were rough concrete, unfinished, showing the marks of the forms they had been poured into decades ago. But even here, life had found purchase. Thin films of bioluminescent algae grew in patches on the walls, glowing with a faint green light that was just barely enough to see by. Tiny plants, she didn't know what species, had never been able to identify them, grew from cracks and crevices, their leaves no larger than her thumbnail, their roots somehow finding enough soil and water in what appeared to be solid concrete. The passage wound and turned, following no logical path, sometimes branching into side corridors that dead-ended or looped back on themselves. Mara knew the correct route by long familiarity, but she could imagine someone unfamiliar with the gardens getting lost here, wandering in circles, becoming disoriented in the maze of identical-looking passages. But eventually, as it always did, the passage opened, and she emerged into the root walk proper. Here, the roots of the bioengineered plants had broken through the concrete walls and ceiling, cracking the industrial materials as surely as tree roots crack sidewalks, but on a much larger scale. The roots were massive, some as thick as Mara's entire body, and they had created natural arches overhead, interwoven so densely that they formed what was essentially a tunnel, a corridor of living wood that extended for perhaps 200 feet through this section of the gardens. The roots themselves were extraordinary to look at. They had the texture of tree bark but smoother, almost polished, and they glowed with a soft amber light that came from somewhere deep within their structure. Whether this glow was bioluminescence like the other plants or simply the roots' way of capturing and re-emitting light from elsewhere, Mara had never been certain. But the effect was beautiful, warm, inviting, like being inside a cathedral made not of stone but of living tissue. As Mara entered the root walk, the sounds of the gardens, the distant trickling of water, the faint hum of the city above, even the slowly fading music of the glass lilies behind her, all faded away, dampened by the dense canopy of roots overhead. The roots acted as sound insulation, absorbing vibrations, creating an acoustic space that was profoundly, almost unnaturally quiet. Her footsteps made no sound on the moss-covered floor. Her breathing, which she could usually hear in the general quiet of the gardens, became inaudible, or at least seemed so. Even the sound of her clothing rustling as she moved seemed muted, distant, as though happening to someone else. This was a place of deep silence, of the kind of quiet that exists in very few places in the modern world, the kind that most people never experience, the kind that can be unsettling if you're not accustomed to it, if you've spent your whole life surrounded by noise. But Mara had come to love this silence. She found it restorative, cleansing, like a bath for her nervous system. In the root walk, she could hear herself think, or rather, she could hear the absence of thought, could experience what her mind was like when it wasn't generating its constant stream of commentary and analysis and worry. She walked slowly through the tunnel of roots, her lantern casting soft shadows on the organic architecture around her. The shadows moved as she moved, making the roots seem to writhe and twist gently, though of course they were perfectly still, as rooted things must be. Here, too, things had changed. As her eyes adjusted to the particular quality of light in the root walk, Mara began to notice new roots emerging from the walls, younger and more delicate than the established ones that formed the main canopy. These new roots were thin, no thicker than her wrist at their widest point, and they glowed with a brighter light than the older roots, an almost white luminescence that stood out against the amber glow of the established structure. And these new roots were reaching, actively growing, extending through the air in ways that defied the usual gravitational tropism that plant roots normally followed. Instead of growing downward toward water and soil, these roots were growing horizontally, reaching across the empty space of the pathway, seeking their partners on the opposite wall. Mara paused beneath one of these reaching roots, watching it closely. As she observed, and she wasn't certain at first if she was really seeing this or if it was a trick of the light, of her tired eyes, of her imagination, the root extended. Not in the slow, imperceptible way that plants usually grew, the way you could only detect growth by comparing measurements taken days or weeks apart. But visibly, measurably, adding perhaps a quarter inch every few minutes, its tip questing blindly through the air like a finger searching for something in the dark. She watched for perhaps 10 minutes, standing perfectly still, barely breathing, and in that time, the root extended by almost 2 inches, getting closer and closer to its partner reaching from the opposite wall. The two root tips were now separated by less than a foot, and they seemed to sense each other, orienting themselves, adjusting their growth direction to aim more precisely at their target. And then, as Mara watched with a sense of witnessing something profound, something rare, the two tips met in the middle of the pathway, touched gently, hesitated as though uncertain, and then began to curl around each other, intertwining, weaving themselves together in a spiral pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost planned, creating a new arch that would eventually, over weeks or months or however long this process took, become as thick and strong as the older arches. Adding another layer to the rootwalk's living architecture. Mara reached up slowly, carefully, and touched the newly joined roots with her fingertips. They were warm, warmer than the older roots, warmer than they should have been based on the ambient air temperature. They pulsed with the same subtle vibration she had felt in the pulse trees, the same energy, the same sense of purposeful activity. The gardens were not just changing their appearance, their patterns of light and sound. They were physically growing, rebuilding themselves, creating new structures, new spaces, new expressions of their essential nature. This was not the slow, steady growth she had observed over years. This was accelerated, intentional, directed toward some goal or outcome that the gardens understood but which she could only dimly perceive. She stood there with her hand on the warm roots, feeling their pulse, their life, their determination to connect, to reach, to build. And she felt herself filling with something that was part awe, part gratitude, part love for this place that had given her so much, that had healed her, that continued to amaze her even after years of intimate familiarity. "Thank you," she whispered into the profound silence of the root walk. "Thank you for showing me this. Thank you for letting me be here, for letting me witness you." The roots, of course, made no response. But their warmth continued, their pulse continued, and Mara chose to accept this as answer enough. She moved onward through the root walk, observing other instances of this accelerated growth, this active building. New roots were emerging all along the walls, reaching for partners, joining together, creating new arches and intersections, gradually transforming the space into something even more complex, even more cathedral-like, even more like the intentional architecture of consciousness than the accidental beauty of nature. The root walk was perhaps 200 feet long, and walking it slowly, stopping frequently to observe and touch and witness, took Mara nearly half an hour. By the time she emerged from the far end, stepping out of that profound silence back into the general quiet of the gardens, she felt both energized and exhausted, filled up and emptied out, changed in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The pathway beyond the root walk opened into a wider space, an area where the industrial ruins had been cleared away more thoroughly, where the floor was level and open, where the ceiling was higher, allowing more sense of openness, of sky, even though they were still deep underground, still far from any actual open air. This was the area of the hush pools. The pools themselves had been part of the original industrial complex, cooling tanks, perhaps, or settling ponds for some manufacturing process, or simply collection points for water that seeped through the foundations. There were 5 of them, arranged in an irregular cluster, each roughly circular, each perhaps 20 feet across, each lined with concrete that had been poured smooth and had somehow remained intact despite decades of abandonment. Over the years, the pools had been colonized by aquatic plants, bioengineered species that someone, at some point, must have introduced deliberately, though who and when remained a mystery. These plants cleaned the water, filtered out impurities, kept the pools from becoming stagnant and foul. The pool's concrete edges had been softened by moss and small ferns that liked the constant moisture. The water itself was crystal clear, so transparent that you could see all the way to the bottom, 3 or 4 feet down, where more moss grew and tiny organisms moved in ways that suggested the pools had their own complete ecosystems. But what made the Hush pools special, what gave them their name, was what they reflected. During the day, the pools showed only the industrial ceiling above, concrete, steel beams, the undersides of walkways and pipes. But at night, they captured something else. The light from the megacity above, the neon signs, the glowing towers, the aerial vehicles with their navigation lights, the endless pulse of advertisement and commerce and human activity, this light filtered down through the broken ceiling, through the gaps and cracks and openings, and was captured by the pool's still surfaces. But the pools didn't reflect this light faithfully, didn't show the harsh reality of the city above. Instead, they transformed it, filtered it, softened it into something dreamlike, something gentle, as though the water itself, or perhaps the aquatic plants, or perhaps something else about the pool's particular chemistry and ecology, removed the harshness and chaos, leaving only soft colors and gentle movement. Looking into the Hush pools at night was like looking at the city through a veil, through a lens that showed not what the city was but what it might have been, what it could be if it slowed down, if it softened, if it learned to breathe. Mara approached the nearest pool slowly, reverently, the way she always did. She set her lantern down on the concrete edge and knelt beside the water, looking down into its depths, into its reflections. But tonight, the water was behaving strangely. The surface should have been still, there was no wind down here, no disturbance that should cause ripples. But the water moved anyway, rippling continuously in concentric circles that expanded outward from various points across the surface, intersecting with each other, creating interference patterns that made the reflected lights of the city above dance and shimmer and transform in ways that were hypnotic, mesmerizing, beautiful. Mara leaned closer, trying to understand what was causing the ripples. She looked for falling drops of water from above, for insects landing on the surface, for any physical cause. But she could see nothing. The ripples appeared spontaneously, arising from the water itself, as though something beneath the surface was breathing, rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. She extended her hand, dipping her fingers into the water, feeling for currents, for temperature gradients, for anything that might explain what she was seeing. The water was warm, soft, no different in its basic properties than it had ever been. But still it moved, still it rippled, still it created those expanding circles that transformed the reflected city into abstract art, into moving patterns of light and color that bore only a passing resemblance to their sources. She withdrew her hand, watching the water droplets fall from her fingers back into the pool, each one creating its own set of ripples that added to the complexity of the pattern. For a moment, the ripples she had created were distinguishable from the spontaneous ones, but within seconds they had merged, become indistinguishable, part of the larger whole. Mara moved to the second pool, then the third, observing. All of them were rippling in this same mysterious way, their surfaces alive with expanding circles, with interference patterns, with movement that had no obvious cause but which was undeniably real, undeniably present. But more than this, and it took her several minutes of observation to fully recognize the pattern, the pools were rippling in sequence. A set of circles would appear in the first pool, expanding outward. Then, a moment later, similar circles would appear in the second pool. Then the third. Then the fourth. Then the fifth. As though something was passing between them beneath the ground, connecting them in ways invisible to the eye but visible in their synchronized behavior. Mara stood at the center point between the 5 pools, the spot where she could see all of them simultaneously, turning slowly, watching the ripples move from pool to pool in that mysterious sequence. And as she watched, she began to see that the ripples were synchronized not just with each other but with everything else she had observed tonight, with the pulsing of the pulse trees, with the harmonies of the glass lilies, with the growth of the roots in the root walk. All of it was connected, all of it was part of the same phenomenon, the same awakening, the same transformation. The gardens were not separate elements existing side by side, maintaining their individual territories, pursuing their individual survival. The gardens were one organism, one vast interconnected entity, and tonight, something within that entity had awakened, had decided to express itself in new ways, had chosen to reveal connections that had perhaps always existed but had never before been visible, never before been active in quite this way. The realization settled over Mara like a warm blanket, like a confirmation of something she had always suspected but never quite articulated. She had thought of herself as tending separate plants, separate areas, separate elements of the gardens. But really, she was witnessing, had been witnessing for years, a single living system, vast and complex and patient, that expressed itself through many forms but remained fundamentally one. And tonight, that system had entered a new phase, a new cycle, a new chapter in its long story. She felt a pull then, a gentle but insistent urge rising from somewhere deep in her chest, her belly, her bones. She needed to go to the center, to the heart of the gardens, to the place where it had all begun. The lumen bloom was calling her, though calling wasn't quite the right word, because it wasn't a sound or a thought or even really a feeling, but something more fundamental, something that bypassed her conscious mind and spoke directly to whatever part of her understood belonging, understood purpose, understood that some moments demand presence, demand witness, demand that you show up fully even if you don't understand why. She picked up her lantern from beside the first pool and turned toward the pathway that led to the heart of the gardens, to the central chamber where the lumen bloom grew. Her pace quickened slightly, not hurrying exactly, because the gardens had taught her that hurrying was rarely necessary and often counterproductive, but moving with purpose, with intention, with the sense that something important was waiting for her, something that had been building all night, all evening, through all the strange and beautiful transformations she had witnessed. The pathway to the heart of the gardens was one she had traveled many times, but always with a sense of ceremony, always with awareness that she was moving towards something sacred, something that commanded respect not through authority or power but through simple presence, through age, through the accumulated wisdom of decades of growth in this forgotten place. The path wound through areas where the old industrial architecture had been so thoroughly consumed by plant life that it was barely recognizable as human construction. Massive pipes, once carrying water or chemicals or compressed air for pneumatic tools, had become trellises for climbing vines that wrapped around them so completely the metal underneath was invisible, transformed from industrial to organic by the patient work of growth and time. Catwalks that had once allowed human workers to move between different levels of the facility had been woven into the garden's structure, their metal gratings softened by moss, their railing supporting flowering plants that spilled over the edges like waterfalls of blooms and leaves. The boundary between what had been built by humans and what had grown naturally had dissolved entirely, creating something hybrid, something that was neither pure nature nor pure architecture but a third thing, a collaboration between human intention and plant evolution, between design and accident, between control and surrender. The air grew warmer as Mara walked, heated by the increased metabolic activity of the plants in this central area, by the density of growth, by the concentration of life. It wrapped around her like a blanket, like an embrace, comfortable without being oppressive, humid without being stifling. She could taste it on her tongue, that particular flavor that air takes on when it's thick with the scent of night-blooming flowers, with moisture, with the subtle chemical signatures of plants actively growing, actively living. The scent here was extraordinary, almost overwhelming in its complexity. There was jasmine, or something very like jasmine, engineered perhaps from jasmine's genetic code but expressed in ways that nature alone would never have achieved. There was honeysuckle, sweet, cloying, the smell of summer evenings and childhood and simpler times. There were other fragrances she couldn't name, had never encountered in any catalog or garden, unique to this place, to these specific plants that had evolved here in isolation, that had mixed and hybridized in ways their creators could never have anticipated. All of these scents were engineered decades ago, programmed into the plant's DNA as features, as selling points, as ways to make these organisms more appealing to potential customers who never materialized. But the plants had continued producing their perfume for no audience, for no purpose, for no reason except that this was what they were, what they did, what they had been made to be. And Mara found this deeply moving, this continuation of beauty in the absence of observers, this persistence of function long after purpose had been forgotten. The pathway narrowed into what was essentially a tunnel of leaves and glowing moss, a passage that felt like entering a living organism, like being swallowed not by something hostile but by something welcoming, something that wanted to hold you, to surround you, to keep you safe. Mara moved through this tunnel with her hands out to either side, letting the plants brush against her fingers, her arms, her face, feeling their warmth, their slight electric quality, the way they seemed to recognize her passage and respond with subtle shifts in luminescence, brightening and dimming like greeting, like acknowledgement, like welcome home. And then the tunnel opened, and she stepped into the heart of the gardens. The central chamber. The place where the lumen bloom grew. This area had once been the central atrium of the industrial complex, a space where multiple warehouse sections converged, where workers would have gathered for breaks, where materials would have been sorted and distributed to different production lines. It had been designed for function, for efficiency, for the movement of goods and people according to schedules and quotas and the relentless logic of industrial production. But all of that was long forgotten now, long irrelevant. The chamber was vast, perhaps 100 feet across, roughly circular, with walls that rose 40 or 50 feet before opening to the broken ceiling above. Through the gaps in that ceiling, you could see into the darkness of Sector 9 beyond, could sense the vast emptiness of the abandoned industrial zone stretching away in all directions. And beyond that, far above, you could see the faint glow of the city, the neon skyline, the towers that never slept, the world that had forgotten this place existed. But none of that mattered once you saw the lumen bloom. It grew from the exact center of the chamber, rising from what had once been a raised concrete platform, perhaps a loading dock, or an assembly area, or a stage for foremen to address workers. The plant had long since cracked that platform, broken through it, consumed it, made it part of itself, so that now it was impossible to say where the concrete ended and the organism began. The lumen bloom was ancient by the standards of bioengineered life forms, one of the very first successful creations from the laboratory that had once occupied this sector. It had been growing here for more than 50 years, longer than Mara had been alive, longer than most people in the city above had been alive, long enough that it had become something more than its creators intended, something that transcended its original design specifications and became simply itself, vast and strange and beautiful in ways that could not have been predicted or controlled. No one knew exactly what species it had been derived from, what genetic material had been mixed and spliced and modified to create it. There were elements of tree in its structure, that much was obvious from the woody trunk, from the way it branched. But there were also elements of flower, of succulent, of coral, of mushroom, of things that didn't seem to belong to any earthly taxonomy, that suggested the scientists who created it had been experimenting not just with combinations of known genes but with entirely novel constructions, with sequences that had never existed in nature, with possibilities that only became visible once you moved beyond the constraints of evolution's slow work and started designing from scratch. The trunk, if it could be called a trunk, if that word could capture the strange hybrid nature of its central mass, was thick and gnarled, perhaps 10 feet in diameter at its base, covered in bark that looked like polished stone, dark and smooth and almost black, but with veins of lighter color running through it, creating patterns that looked almost like writing, almost like language, almost like meaning trying to emerge from random texture. From this central mass, branches extended in all directions, not following any predictable pattern, not adhering to any obvious structural logic, but instead creating a kind of organic architecture that seemed to defy gravity, to ignore the normal rules that governed how plants grew. Some branches extended horizontally for 30 or 40 feet without any obvious support. Others curved upward and then back down in great loops. Still others twisted around themselves in spirals before extending outward at unexpected angles. And from these branches grew the petals. They were enormous, each one the size of a door, some even larger, 8 or 9 feet long, 4 or 5 feet wide at their widest point. They were translucent like the glass lilies but on a massive scale, thin enough that light passed through them, thick enough that they felt substantial, real, permanent. They glowed from within with a soft, warm light, not blue or green or violet like most of the other bioluminescent plants in the gardens, but amber and gold and honey-colored, like candlelight, like firelight, like the last rays of sun before dusk, like the color of late afternoon in autumn when the light gets thick and warm and makes everything it touches look beautiful. The petals were arranged in a loose spiral around the central trunk, radiating outward at different heights, different angles, creating layers of illumination that filled the entire chamber with their glow. Mara had been told, by one of the few other night wanderers she had encountered over the years, that the lumen bloom had once been kept in a laboratory, carefully controlled, its growth monitored and restricted according to research protocols. Its creators had intended it as a proof of concept, as a demonstration of what bioengineering could achieve, but not as something that would be allowed to reach its full potential. But when the laboratories closed and the scientists left, the plant had been forgotten, left behind, abandoned like everything else in Sector 9. And in that forgetting, it had been freed. It had grown beyond anyone's expectations, become more than its creators had ever intended, and now it was simply itself, vast and strange and beautiful, impossible to categorize, impossible to control, impossible to understand through any framework except direct experience, direct presence, direct witness. Usually, under the conditions Mara had observed for years, through all the seasons and cycles she had witnessed, the lumen bloom had 7 petals open at any given time. 7 massive, glowing petals arranged in that loose spiral, providing light and warmth and a sense of presence that dominated the central chamber. The petals would close one by one over the course of several weeks, slowly, gradually, folding back into themselves and returning to tight buds that clustered close to the trunk. And as the old petals closed, new ones would emerge from the branches, slowly unfurling over days or weeks to replace them, maintaining that constant number of 7, that stable configuration. It was a cycle Mara had watched many times, had come to expect, had used as a way of marking time in a place where conventional measures of days and weeks and months felt increasingly irrelevant. But tonight, as Mara entered the central chamber and looked up at the lumen bloom, she saw immediately that something fundamental had changed. An 8th petal had opened. It hung from a branch that Mara had never noticed before, or perhaps had noticed but dismissed as dormant, as just structural support rather than something capable of producing blooms. The branch extended lower than the others, reaching out toward the chamber's edge rather than rising toward the center, and from it hung this new petal, this 8th expression of the plant's essential nature. It was larger than the others, perhaps 10 feet long, wider than Mara was tall, and so bright that it cast the entire chamber in warm, golden light that made everything look softer, kinder, more beautiful than it already was. The petal pulsed gently, rhythmically, in perfect time with everything else she had witnessed tonight: the pulse trees, the glass lilies, the growing roots, the rippling pools, all of it connected, all of it synchronized, all of it part of this single moment of transformation. Mara stood at the chamber's entrance, transfixed, unable to move, barely able to breathe. The petal dominated her vision, filled her awareness, made everything else seem suddenly less important, less real. The light it cast was so luminous it almost hurt to look at directly, but not quite. It was the kind of light that wanted to be seen, that invited your attention without demanding it, that welcomed your gaze without forcing it. She felt tears on her face again, the second time tonight she had cried without consciously deciding to, her body responding to beauty with an emotional intensity that bypassed all her usual defenses, all her careful control, all the walls she had built over years of trying to function in a world that demanded you always be composed, always be professional, always be in control. But here, in the gardens, she didn't need those walls. Here, she was allowed to feel everything fully, to respond to beauty with tears, to acknowledge wonder with trembling, to experience awe without shame or self-consciousness. She approached slowly, reverently, her lantern unnecessary now in the radiance of the eighth petal, its warm light rendering her small light irrelevant, redundant. She walked across the broken concrete of the chamber floor, stepping over roots and around smaller plants that had clustered near the lumen bloom as though seeking its shelter, its presence, its protection. When she reached the base of the great plant, she stopped, tilted her head back, and simply looked up into the canopy of glowing petals above her. The eighth petal hung directly over where she stood, so close she could have reached up and touched it if she had wanted to, if she had dared to disturb it with her merely human hands. The petal was so luminous it seemed to contain its own sun, its own star, generating light from some process deep within its cellular structure that she couldn't begin to understand. The light cast shadows, her own shadow stretched out behind her, long and dark against the lighter concrete, but they were soft shadows, kind shadows, not the harsh blacks and whites of artificial lighting but gradients, transitions, the natural play of light and absence that made everything look more three-dimensional, more real, more present. The air here was warmest of all, heated by the lumen bloom's increased activity, by whatever was happening inside it that had triggered this new growth, this eighth petal, this transformation. The warmth seeped into Mara's skin, into her muscles, into her bones, loosening tension she hadn't known she was carrying, releasing tightness in her shoulders, her back, her jaw. She breathed deeply, drawing in the scent of the lumen bloom, something sweet and complex, like honey mixed with smoke, like flowers and earth and rain all at once, like every good smell she had ever encountered compressed into a single fragrance that was almost overwhelming in its richness, its intensity, its presence. And as she stood there, breathing, watching the petal pulse with its slow, steady rhythm, understanding began to settle into her like sediment drifting to the bottom of still water. The gardens were not broken. Nothing was wrong. Nothing needed fixing or intervention or correction. The changes she had witnessed tonight, the pulsing trees, the harmonizing lilies, the growing roots, the rippling pools, this eighth petal, none of it was malfunction or dysfunction or damage. The gardens had simply entered a new cycle. It was so obvious now, so clear. Why had she even questioned it? Why had she felt that initial flutter of concern when she first noticed the changes? Of course the gardens would change. Of course they would grow in new ways. They were alive, and living things did not remain static, did not stay the same forever, did not maintain one configuration indefinitely. The lumen bloom was the heart of this place, the oldest organism, the foundation from which everything else had grown or around which everything else had arranged itself. And like any living heart, it did not beat at the same pace forever. There were rhythms within rhythms, cycles within cycles, patterns that repeated but never quite the same way twice, variations within the theme that made life interesting, that made growth possible, that allowed for adaptation and evolution and change. For years, for however long Mara had been here, for however long before she arrived, the gardens had maintained one pattern, one level of activity, one expression of their essential nature. 7 petals on the lumen bloom. Steady pulsing in the pulse trees. Random chiming from the glass lilies. Slow, predictable growth in the root walk. Still surfaces on the hush pools. And now, they had decided, if a garden could be said to decide, if consciousness was the right word for whatever awareness plants possessed or didn't possess, to express themselves differently. To grow in new directions. To create new patterns. To bloom. The 8th petal was not an anomaly. It was an announcement. A declaration. A statement that said, something new is beginning. A chapter is turning. A cycle is completing and a new one is starting. We are not what we were, and we are not yet what we will become, but we are changing, and the change is good, and the change is right, and the change is exactly what should be happening at exactly this moment. Mara felt the understanding settle all the way down into her body, into her cells, into whatever part of her recognized truth when it appeared. She had not needed to fix anything tonight. She had not needed to solve any problem or prevent any disaster or correct any error. She had simply needed to witness. To be present. To pay attention. To honor the garden's transformation with her attention, with her care, with her willingness to see what was actually happening rather than what she expected or feared. This was the fundamental lesson the gardens had been teaching her all along. From the very first night she stumbled into them exhausted and broken. You do not need to control everything. You do not need to optimize everything. You do not need to be constantly productive and useful and efficient. Sometimes, often, the most important thing you can do is simply be present, simply witness, simply allow things to unfold in their own time, by their own nature, according to their own wisdom that might be deeper and older and more patient than anything your conscious mind can access. The tears continued streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sadness now, if they ever had been. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of joy, of the simple, profound recognition that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do, which was nothing except being here, standing beneath this great plant, watching its 8th petal pulse with light, breathing in its fragrance, feeling its warmth on her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly from emotion, from the tightness in her throat. "Thank you for letting me see this. Thank you for growing here, for existing here, for persisting here in this forgotten place where no one else was watching, where no one else cared. Thank you for teaching me how to be slow, how to be patient, how to witness without needing to change what I'm witnessing. Thank you for accepting me when I had nowhere else to go, when I couldn't bear one more minute in that apartment, in that city, in that life that was killing me slowly. Thank you for giving me purpose that doesn't exhaust me, work that doesn't drain me, a home that feels like home. Thank you for this." The lumen bloom, of course, did not respond in any way that human language could capture, in any way that could be recorded or measured or proven. But its petal pulsed a little brighter for just a moment, or Mara thought it did, or chose to believe it did, or simply needed it to have done so, and she took that as acknowledgement, or perhaps just coincidence, or perhaps something in between that didn't need a name, didn't need to be explained, could simply exist as a moment of connection between a woman and a plant, between consciousness and whatever lay on the other side of consciousness, between the known and the unknown. She stood there for a long time, not thinking, not planning, not worrying, just being. The warmth of the earth beneath her feet seeped up into her body, grounding her, anchoring her in the present moment. The scent of the lumen bloom filled her lungs with each breath, sweet and complex and utterly unique. The golden light bathed her skin, her closed eyelids, creating patterns in her vision that danced and swirled like dreams, like memories, like possibilities. Time became elastic again, meaningless, irrelevant. She might have been standing there for minutes or hours, it didn't matter. The gardens had taught her that time was not the precious, limited resource the city insisted it was, not something to be hoarded and optimized and spent wisely. Time was simply the medium in which change happened, the space in which growth occurred, and there was always enough of it for what mattered, always enough for beauty, always enough for witness. Eventually, though, she became aware that her body was tired, not in a draining way, not in the exhausted, depleted way she used to feel in her old life, but in the pleasant, heavy way that comes after a long walk, after physical exertion, after witnessing something important that required your full attention, your complete presence. Her legs were a little stiff from standing. Her back ached slightly. Her eyes wanted to close, not from boredom but from satisfaction, from completion, from having seen enough for one night. It was time to return to her glass house. Time to rest. Time to let her body process what her mind had witnessed, let her unconscious integrate these new understandings while she slept. She opened her eyes, when had she closed them, and took one last long look at the 8th petal, memorizing its shape, its glow, its impossible beauty. She would come back tomorrow to see how it had changed, how it had developed, what new expressions it might offer. But for tonight, she had seen enough, been present enough, witnessed enough. Good night, she said softly to the lumen bloom, to the entire garden, to the night itself, to whatever consciousness or awareness might be listening or might not be but which she chose to address anyway. I'll come back tomorrow. And the day after. I'll keep watching. I'll keep witnessing. I'll be here as long as you need me, as long as I'm able. I promise. Then she turned, picked up her lantern from where she had set it down. Its light seemed almost comically small now, almost unnecessary after the brilliance of the 8th petal, and made her way back through the tunnel of leaves, back into the gardens proper, beginning the return journey to her home. As she walked, she noticed that the artificial fireflies were following her again, a small constellation of golden lights drifting in her wake, keeping her company on her journey home. She smiled at them, at these tiny companions, these remnants of old technology that had somehow become part of something living and whole, that had persisted long past their intended lifespan and found new purpose in this place, or perhaps no purpose at all except simply existing, simply being, which was perhaps purpose enough. She retraced her path through the gardens, moving slowly, savoring each section as she passed through it. Past the hushed pools, their surfaces still rippling mysteriously in the reflected light of the city above. Through the root walk, where the newly joined roots pulsed with warmth and life. Past the clearing where the glass lilies still held their pose, their crystal petals spread wide, their harmonizing tones gradually fading into silence. Through the grove of pulse trees, their lights still ticking in that new, synchronized pattern. Each area was still displaying its transformation, still expressing this new phase the gardens had entered, and Mara acknowledged each one as she passed, whispering greetings, offering thanks, recognizing their presence, their participation in this larger awakening. By the time she reached the glasshouse, she was yawning, her body's natural rhythms asserting themselves, insisting that she had been awake long enough, that rest was needed now, that sleep was not just permitted but required. She pushed open the door of the glasshouse. It was never locked. There was no need for locks here, no threat to guard against, no danger to prevent, and stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the familiar smell of her small space, by the warmth that lingered from the afternoon, by the presence of her few belongings arranged exactly as she had left them. Her small living space was exactly as she remembered, as she had seen it thousands of times before. A narrow bed with simple blankets, cotton, well-worn, soft as butter from years of washing. A table made from an old shipping pallet that she had sanded smooth and sealed with oil, its surface showing the marks of use, the stains from tea and water and the various substances she used for tending the gardens. Shelves built from scavenged wood and metal brackets, holding a few books, favorites she had read many times, novels that felt like old friends, poetry that never failed to move her. A few tools for working in the gardens, pruning shears, a small shovel, lengths of soft cord for training vines. A few small plants in pots that she kept for companionship, for the pleasure of having green growing things even in this enclosed space, a small fern, a succulent with thick leaves, a cutting from one of the garden plants that she was slowly propagating. A kettle and a hot plate for making tea, connected to some mysterious power source that still worked after all these years, fed by the city's grid in ways she didn't understand and didn't need to understand. A small collection of herbs and dried flowers for tea, stored in old jars with handwritten labels. A cup, a bowl, a spoon, a knife. Everything she needed and nothing she didn't, every object chosen for function or beauty or both. No clutter, no excess, no possessions kept out of obligation or guilt or the fear of need. This was enough. This was plenty. This was home. She set her lantern on the table, watching its woven vine body glow softly, reliably, faithfully. The LED inside was dimming slightly. She had noticed it over the past weeks, reaching the end of its long life, burning out gradually the way all things eventually burned out, wore out, came to the end of their useful existence. She would need to replace it soon, salvage another LED from the ruins, rebuild the lantern's light source so it could continue serving its purpose. But not tonight. Tonight, it still gave enough light, still illuminated her small space adequately, still fulfilled its function. She changed out of her day clothes, pants and a shirt worn soft from use, comfortable for walking the gardens, practical for the work of tending, and into sleep clothes, soft cotton that had been washed so many times it was almost translucent, feather light against her skin, gentle and non-restrictive, allowing her body to move freely in sleep, allowing her to breathe without constraint. She pulled back the blankets on her bed, simple cotton, layered for warmth, heavy enough to provide comfort without being oppressive, and slipped underneath them, feeling their familiar weight settle over her like a gentle hand, like a blessing, like the embrace of something that knew her completely and loved her anyway. Through the mismatched panels of her glass house, some frosted, some clear, some tinted green with age, each one showing a slightly different view, she could see the gardens beyond, still glowing, still pulsing with their new rhythms, still expressing this transformation that had begun tonight and would continue for days or weeks or however long it took to complete. The 8th petal of the lumen bloom was visible even from here, its golden light bright enough to illuminate the entire central chamber, to cast shadows and highlights across the surrounding ruins, to announce itself to the darkness like a beacon, like a lighthouse, like a statement of presence and purpose. The city above was invisible from this angle, just a faint ambient glow diffused through the perpetual mist that hung in the garden's air, transformed from harsh neon into something soft and dreamy, something that couldn't hurt you, couldn't demand anything from you, couldn't insist that you be faster, better, more productive, more efficient, more optimized. Down here, in the gardens, in this small glass house at the edge of wonder, Mara was safe. She was home. She was exactly where she belonged. She closed her eyes and let her breath deepen, settle into the rhythm of the gardens, into the pulse of the lumen bloom, into the ancient, patient beat of growth and change and renewal that had been happening since long before she arrived and would continue long after she was gone. She thought about the 8th petal, about what it meant, but not in any analytical way, not trying to understand it intellectually or categorize it or explain it. She simply held it in her mind like a glowing seed, like a promise, like a gift offered freely without expectation of return. The gardens were evolving. After years of stability, after maintaining one pattern for so long it had seemed permanent, they had decided it was time for something new. New growth. New patterns. New expressions of beauty. new ways of being in the world. And she would be here to witness it. Day after day, night after night, for as long as she was needed or wanted or able. That was her purpose, her calling, her joy. Not to control or optimize or improve, but simply to be present, to pay attention, to witness with love and care and patience whatever the gardens chose to reveal. The sound of trickling water drifted through the glasshouse walls, a constant background music that she had long since stopped consciously noticing but which was always there, always present, always offering its particular form of comfort, its reminder that life flowed. That change happened, that nothing stayed the same but that this was not a tragedy, this was simply the nature of existence. Somewhere in the distance, a glass lily chimed a single pure note, then fell silent. An artificial firefly bumped gently against one of the clear panels of her glasshouse, its light winking on and off in whatever pattern its degraded programming dictated, then drifted away into the darkness, continuing its eternal patrol of the gardens. Mara's breathing slowed further, deepened, synchronized perfectly with the pulse of the gardens outside, with the rhythm that underlay everything, that connected everything, that held everything together in one vast, interconnected web of life and light and patient transformation. Her body grew heavy, sinking into the mattress, into the blankets, into the particular quality of relaxation that comes when you are completely safe, completely held, completely at home. Her muscles released their tension, letting go of the day's walking, the night's observations, surrendering to gravity, to rest, to the sweet oblivion of sleep. Her mind emptied of thought, became simply a space of awareness gradually narrowing, focusing down to a single point of presence and then dissolving even that, becoming nothing except the breath, the heartbeat, the slow fade into unconsciousness. In her mind's eye, in that space between waking and sleeping where images become more vivid than reality, where memory and imagination blend into something neither true nor false but simply present, she saw the gardens as she had walked them tonight. She saw the pathways glowing with their soft bioluminescent moss, creating ribbons of blue-green light that wound through the darkness like veins carrying light instead of blood, like rivers carrying luminescence instead of water. She saw the pulse trees with their translucent bark and glowing sap, their new pattern of ticking light creating rhythms that resonated in her chest, that synchronized with her heartbeat, that reminded her she was part of something larger, something older, something that would continue long after her individual life had ended. She saw the glass lilies in their clearing, their crystal petals spread wide like hands opened in offering, like stars brought down to earth and given physical form, their harmonizing tones still echoing in her memory, creating chords that seemed to speak of connection, of unity, of the fundamental interconnectedness that underlies all apparent separation, all seeming division. She saw the root walk with its dense canopy of living arches, its profound silence that allowed her to hear herself, to know herself, to recognize the voice of her own being beneath all the noise and chatter and constant demands that the city had imposed on her consciousness. She saw the new roots reaching for each other, joining in the empty air, creating new structures, new spaces, new possibilities that hadn't existed before tonight but would exist tomorrow, would exist for years to come, would become part of the garden's permanent architecture. She saw the hush pools with their mysterious ripples, their way of capturing the city's harsh light and transforming it into something dreamlike, something gentle, something that showed not what the city was but what it could be if only it learned to slow down, to soften, to breathe. She saw the patterns on their surfaces, the interference of expanding circles, the way each pool connected to the others beneath the ground, invisible but undeniable, like the connections between all living things, like the web of relationship that holds everything together even when we can't see the threads. And at the center of it all, dominating her internal vision, filling her awareness even as sleep claimed more and more of her conscious mind, she saw the lumen bloom with its eighth petal, its impossible beauty, its patient transformation, its willingness to change after years of stability, its demonstration that nothing is permanent except change itself, that the only constant is transformation, that life means growth and growth means becoming something you weren't before. Something new, something unknown, something that might be beautiful in ways you cannot yet imagine. She saw all of this, held all of this, carried all of this with her into sleep, and as her conscious mind released its grip on perception, as her thoughts dissolved into the formless space that exists beneath thought, the images remained, becoming dreams, becoming the substance of her unconscious processing, becoming seeds that would grow in the darkness of sleep and flower into new understanding when she woke. The gardens breathed outside her glasshouse, their soft glow a constant presence, a night light for the soul, a reminder that darkness is not empty, that night is not absence but a different kind of presence, that rest is not nothing but the necessary complement to action, the space in which healing happens, in which integration occurs, in which the body repairs itself and the mind makes sense of experience. The eighth petal continued glowing on through the night, its light steady and sure, a beacon for no one in particular, a beauty offered freely to the darkness with no expectation of appreciation, no need for witness, no requirement of recognition. It glowed because that was what it did, what it was, what it had been made to be. And in this, it was like all the most essential things: breathing, the beating of a heart, the slow turn of seasons, the patient work of growth, things that happened whether anyone was watching or not, whether anyone cared or not, because they were necessary, because they were right, because they were true to their own nature. And in the root walk, the young roots that had joined tonight continued their slow fusion, their cells knitting together, their tissues merging into unity, creating strength from connection, creating structure from relationship, demonstrating that growth happens not in isolation but in joining, not in separation but in union. And in the clearing, the glass lilies continued their soft presence, their crystal petals no longer chiming but still open, still spread wide, still catching and refracting any light that touched them, still creating beauty simply by existing, simply by being what they were, asking nothing, offering everything. And at the hush pools, the water continued its mysterious rippling, its surfaces alive with expanding circles, with patterns that emerged from no obvious cause but which were nonetheless real, nonetheless present, nonetheless part of the larger choreography that the gardens were performing, the dance they were dancing, the story they were telling about transformation and renewal and the courage it takes to change, to grow, to become something new. And along all the pathways, through all the sections and areas and zones that made up this vast interconnected space, the bioluminescent moss pulsed with its slow, ancient rhythm, the same rhythm it had kept for decades, patient and unwavering, a heartbeat made of light, a clock that measured not hours or minutes but cycles of growth and rest, of bloom and fade, of beginning and ending and beginning again. The gardens were one organism, one vast distributed consciousness, one entity expressing itself through countless forms, countless voices, countless variations on the same essential theme. And tonight, that organism had entered a new chapter in its long, slow story. Tonight, it had decided, or been prompted, or simply responded to some internal schedule that humans could never fully understand, to transform, to grow, to express itself in new ways. And Mara, sleeping now in her small glasshouse at the edge of this wonder, was part of that organism, part of that story, part of that transformation. Not separate from the gardens but woven into them, not above them as caretaker or below them as servant but function_calls invoke name equals, artifacts, parameter name equals, command, update /parameter name equals, ID, night_gardens_story_3 /parameter name equals, new_str, and Mara, sleeping now in her small glasshouse at the edge of this wonder, was part of that organism, part of that story, part of that transformation. Not separate from the gardens but woven into them, not above them as caretaker or below them as servant but beside them as companion, as witness, as the consciousness that observed and therefore made real, the awareness that attended and therefore gave meaning. In the morning, when the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the perpetual smog of the megacity, filtering down through the layers of elevated highways and suspended walkways and forgotten maintenance corridors, the glass lilies would close their petals again, folding them carefully back into tight buds, storing their light for another night, conserving their energy for the next opening. The pulse trees would continue their new pattern, but perhaps a little slower, a little less intense, resting in the way that even energetic systems must rest. The eighth petal of the lumen bloom would continue glowing, but softer now, less insistent, allowing the space for other forms of light, other expressions of beauty. And Mara would wake naturally, without alarm, without jarring transition from sleep to waking, her body knowing intuitively when it had rested enough, when it had processed enough, when it was time to return to consciousness and begin again the work of witnessing, of being present, of paying attention to what the gardens chose to reveal. She would rise slowly, without rushing, allowing her body time to remember itself, to reconnect mind and flesh, to return fully to the present moment. She would stretch, feeling her spine lengthen, her muscles warm, her joints loosen, her breath deepen. She would open the door of her glasshouse and step out into the garden's morning light, soft and diffuse, gentler than the night's intensity, quieter but no less beautiful. She would make herself tea from the herbs she had gathered, the evening star flowers that grew nowhere else, that had no name except the one she had given them. She would sip it slowly, savoring its warmth, its familiar taste, its way of grounding her in the day, in the body, in the simple pleasure of hot liquid on a cool morning. And then she would walk the gardens again, observing the changes that night had brought, noting how the transformation continued, how the new patterns had developed, how the eighth petal looked in morning light compared to how it had appeared at midnight. She would check on the glass lilies, now closed again, their petals folded like sleeping hands. She would visit the pulse trees, touching their smooth bark, feeling their warmth, acknowledging their presence. She would walk through the root walk, observing how the newly joined roots had strengthened overnight, how they had become more integrated, more unified. She would sit beside the hush pools, watching how they reflected morning light differently than they reflected night glow, how their rippling had changed or remained the same, how they participated in the garden's ongoing transformation. And in all of this, she would not be working, not in the way the city understood work, not in the way she had once worked at her neural interface job, optimizing logistics, maximizing efficiency, driving herself toward exhaustion in pursuit of goals that someone else had defined. Instead, she would be witnessing, being present, paying attention, loving what she saw with a love that asked nothing in return, that simply delighted in existence, in beauty, in the patient unfolding of life according to its own mysterious rhythms. This was her purpose. This was her calling. This was what she had been searching for without knowing she was searching, what she had needed without knowing she needed it, what had saved her life without her quite realizing she needed saving until she found herself here, in these gardens, in this forgotten place where beauty persisted without audience, where life continued without purpose beyond its own continuation, where peace existed not as the absence of something but as the presence of everything that mattered. But that was tomorrow, and tomorrow was far away, as distant as the stars, as remote as the past, as impossible to grasp as the future. For now, there was only this, the soft darkness of the glasshouse, the gentle weight of blankets, the warm air carrying the scent of earth and growing things, the sound of water trickling somewhere outside, constant and patient and eternal. The soft pulse of light through mismatched glass panels, blue and green and amber and gold, creating patterns on the ceiling, on the walls, shifting slowly as the gardens breathed, as they pulsed, as they lived their vast, slow life. For now, there was only the breath, moving in and out of lungs, automatic and essential, requiring no thought, no effort, simply happening the way all the most important things happen, without fanfare, without announcement, with perfect reliability. For now, there was only the heartbeat, steady and sure, pumping blood through veins and arteries, carrying oxygen to cells, sustaining life, maintaining the boundary between being and non-being, between existence and void, doing its quiet work without praise, without recognition, without any need for either. For now, there was only the absolute and perfect stillness that exists at the center of all living things, the eye of the hurricane, the calm beneath the surface chaos, the place where nothing needs to happen, nothing needs to be done, nothing needs to be understood or explained or justified. For now, there was only sleep. Deep, dreamless, restorative sleep. The kind of sleep that heals, that repairs, that knits together what was torn, that soothes what was inflamed, that calms what was agitated. The kind of sleep that transforms, that allows you to wake up slightly different than you were when you fell asleep, changed in small but essential ways, evolved in directions you couldn't consciously choose but which your body and mind and spirit know are necessary. The kind of sleep that comes when you are finally safe enough, quiet enough, held gently enough by the world to let go completely, to trust that you will still exist when you wake, that the world will still be here, that life will continue its patient work without requiring your vigilance, your control, your constant management. The gardens hummed their soft, meditative frequency, subsonic and subtle, more felt than heard, resonating in bones and tissues, in the fluid of cells, in the electricity of nerves. It was the same frequency that exists in forests, in oceans, in mountains, in any place where life has accumulated enough mass, enough age, enough interconnection to generate what some call presence, what others call consciousness, what might simply be the collective hum of countless organisms existing together, supporting each other, participating in the larger work of maintaining the conditions for life to continue. And the night held everything gently, without judgment, without preference, without any demand that things be different than they were. The night accepted everything, the broken concrete and the growing plants, the abandoned machinery and the luminescent moss, the forgotten industrial past and the living present, the sleeping woman in her small glass house and the vast, patient garden surrounding her. The night held all of it with equal care, equal tenderness, equal willingness to allow things to be exactly what they were, to exist exactly as they needed to exist, to transform exactly as slowly or as quickly as their nature required. Nothing needed to be done. Nothing needed to be fixed. Nothing needed to be understood. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was unfolding in its own time, at its own pace, according to its own nature. Everything was well. The light pulsed slowly, so slowly, each pulse lasting seconds, each cycle taking minutes. Time stretched out into something that was no longer time but simply duration, simply the space in which being happened, the medium in which existence occurred. The water flowed, molecule by molecule, following gravity, following the channels that had been prepared for it, making its small sounds, its gentle music, its contribution to the garden's overall symphony of life. The leaves rustled in air currents that had no source, no explanation, that simply existed the way air always moves, seeking equilibrium, seeking balance, creating small disturbances that settled into larger patterns, that formed winds, that formed weather, that formed the conditions for life. And all of it, every sound and sight and sensation, every element of this vast interconnected system, conspired toward one single purpose, one unified intention, one shared goal, the continuation of life, the persistence of beauty, the patient work of growth and transformation and renewal that had been happening since the first cells divided, since the first organisms learned to photosynthesize, since life first decided that it preferred existence to non-existence. And began the long, slow work of complexifying, of organizing, of building systems that could maintain themselves, that could repair damage, that could adapt to change, that could endure. And in the glass house at the edge of the night gardens, in a small bed under simple blankets, breathing in rhythm with the gardens outside, Mara slept. and dreamed of light, and of leaves, and of the slow, patient turning of cycles within cycles, of seasons within seasons, of beauty that existed for no reason except that it could, and did, and always would. The night deepened, reaching that particular quality of darkness that exists in the hours before dawn, when even the city above grew quieter, when even the restless millions slowed their pace, when even the machines paused briefly in their endless work. The gardens continued their soft glow, undimmed, unwavering, constant as the stars, reliable as the tide, patient as stone. And all was soft, and warm, and infinitely, perfectly still, and good. So good. Everything was good. Everything was exactly as it needed to be. And sleep continued. And dreams continued. And life continued. And in the continuing, in the persisting, in the simple fact of existing from one moment to the next, there was enough. There was more than enough. There was everything.